Here's a question for you. How far would you go for what's rightfully yours? Would you expose family secrets? Would you air private letters to the world? Would you destroy someone's reputation to get justice? Would you weaponize the internet against a family? Remember, I've been thinking about this story for weeks now. Months, actually. And honestly, I still don't know how I feel about it. Because on one hand, I completely understand the rage, the betrayal, the absolute desperation of feeling invisible. But on the other hand, the cost of winning was so incredibly high that I'm not entirely sure anyone actually won. Not really. Let me tell you about Rachel. And fair warning, this story gets complicated. It gets messy. Because real life is messy. And family drama mixed with money, that's a recipe for absolute chaos. Rachel is 34 years old. She lives in Portland, Oregon, works as a graphic designer for a small marketing agency, and until about 6 months ago, she thought she had a pretty decent handle on her life. Not perfect, not Instagram-worthy, but manageable. She had her one-bedroom apartment in Southeast Portland, her work projects, her morning coffee routine at the local cafe, her Thursday yoga class, and she had her family. Or what was left of it anyway. Rachel has 2 siblings. Michael, who's 38, and Sophie, who's 29. The 3 of them grew up together in a decent middle-class home just outside of Seattle, in one of those suburban neighborhoods where everyone knows everyone else's business. Their father, Robert, was a commercial real estate developer. Not a huge name or anything, but he did well for himself. Built a solid business over 30 years. Provided for his family. Made sure his kids went to good schools, had what they needed. He wasn't the warmest guy in the world, honestly. A bit distant, a bit too focused on work. But he was there, dependable, fair. Or at least Rachel always thought he was fair. Their mother, Catherine, died when Rachel was 17 years old. Cancer. Breast cancer that spread before they caught it. It was absolutely brutal. One of those long, drawn-out situations where everyone in the family knows what's coming, but no one wants to say it out loud, because saying it makes it real. Catherine fought for 2 years. Chemo, radiation, clinical trials, everything the doctors could throw at it, and then on a cold February morning, she was gone. Robert grieved in his own quiet way. The kids grieved loudly and messily, the way teenagers and young adults do. The house felt empty in a way that had absolutely nothing to do with physical space and everything to do with emotional absence. Catherine had been the heart of the family. The one who remembered birthdays and organized holiday dinners and made sure everyone felt connected. Without her, they were just 4 people living in the same house, orbiting around each other without really touching. 2 years later, Robert met Diane. Diane was 42 at the time. Never been married, no kids, no previous serious relationships as far as anyone knew. She worked as an event coordinator for a hotel chain and met Robert at some kind of business conference in Vancouver. She was polished in that corporate way. Professional, well-dressed, friendly enough. Not warm exactly, but pleasant enough to be around. Robert started dating her quietly, and within a year they were engaged. 6 months after that, married. Rachel was 19 when it happened. Home from her sophomore year of college for the summer. Michael was 23, just starting his first real job. Sophie was only 14, still in high school, still living at home. And absolutely none of them were thrilled about this new development. Not because Diane was obviously terrible or cruel or anything like that. She wasn't. She didn't try to replace their mother, which was good. She didn't discipline them or try to insert herself into their lives in inappropriate ways. She just sort of existed on the periphery. Polite, but distant. Present, but not really there. For 15 years, that's exactly how it was. Diane played the role of dutiful wife. She attended family dinners at Thanksgiving and Christmas. She sent birthday cards with generic messages and $50 checks. She smiled appropriately in family photos. But there was always this undercurrent, this sense that she was performing the role rather than actually living it, going through the motions because that's what was expected. And the kids, now adults with their own lives and problems, tolerated her for their father's sake. Because Robert seemed content, or at least comfortable, and that felt like enough. Then, 6 months ago, Robert died. Heart attack. Completely sudden. No warning signs, no previous health scares, nothing. He was 67 years old. One minute, he was absolutely fine playing golf on a Saturday morning with his usual foursome at the country club. The next minute, he collapsed on the 7th green. By the time the ambulance arrived, he was gone. The kind of death people call a blessing because it was quick, because there was no suffering, because he didn't linger in a hospital bed for weeks. But for the family left behind, it was a devastating shock. No time to prepare, no warning, no chance to say goodbye or have those important final conversations. Just instant, complete emptiness. The funeral was a blur of black clothing and sympathetic whispers. Rachel remembers standing at the graveside service, staring at the mahogany casket, thinking about all the conversations she never had with her father. All the things she never said. All the questions she never asked. Michael stood next to her, stoic and stone-faced, barely showing any emotion at all. Sophie cried openly, tears streaming down her face throughout the entire service. And Diane wore an elegant black dress and pearls, and accepted condolences from friends and colleagues with a gracious nod and a sad smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. A week later, they all gathered at the lawyer's office for the reading of the will. Rachel wasn't expecting much, honestly. Maybe some personal items. Her father's watch, perhaps, or some books from his study. Maybe a small amount of money to help with expenses. She knew her father had assets, the business which he'd built from scratch, the house in Seattle which was easily worth $700,000 in that market, investment accounts, retirement savings. But she assumed logically that most of it would go to Diane. That made perfect sense. She was his wife. She'd been married to him for 15 years. Of course, she'd inherit the bulk of the estate. What Rachel absolutely did not expect was what actually happened. The lawyer, an older gentleman named Gerald Hutchins, who'd known Robert for 20 years, sat behind his massive oak desk and opened the file with Robert's name on the tab. He cleared his throat uncomfortably, adjusted his glasses, and then he began to read, in that formal, careful way lawyers do. Everything. The house, the business shares, which were worth approximately $1.8 million, the investment accounts, the retirement savings, the bank accounts, the cars, the vacation property in Lake Chelan. All of it, every single asset, went to Diane. The total estate was valued at approximately $4.2 million. And every single cent of it was legally, completely, irrevocably Diane's property. But there was a clause. One single paragraph at the end of the will. The lawyer read it slowly, carefully, like he knew it was going to cause problems. Rachel remembers every single word because they're burned into her brain. Quote, I entrust my entire estate to my beloved wife Diane, with a sincere request that she do the right thing and divide it fairly among my children, according to her best judgment. I trust her integrity and her sense of fairness to honor this wish in a way that reflects our shared values. End quote. Rachel sat there in the leather chair trying to process what she'd just heard. Michael leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the lawyer with an expression of complete disbelief. Sophie looked confused, like she didn't quite understand what any of this meant. Diane stared straight ahead at the wall behind the lawyer's desk, her face completely unreadable. Blank. Neutral. Giving nothing away. Gerald cleared his throat again. Explained in uncomfortable detail that the clause was not legally binding. It was what's called a precatory language. A wish, a request, a moral suggestion. Diane had absolutely no legal obligation whatsoever to give the children anything, not $1. The will was structured this way completely intentionally. Robert had made this choice while of sound mind with full knowledge of what he was doing. Diane could honor the request or ignore it entirely. It was completely up to her. Michael spoke first, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. So we get nothing. Absolutely nothing. Unless Diane decides out of the goodness of her heart to give us something. The lawyer nodded slowly. That is correct, yes. Your father structured the will this way intentionally. Sophie started crying. Not loud, dramatic sobs, but quiet tears that rolled down her cheeks while she stared at her hands. Rachel felt completely numb. Like someone had pressed pause on her emotional responses, and she was just floating somewhere outside her body watching this happen to someone else. And Diane simply folded her hands in her lap, pressed her lips together slightly, and said absolutely nothing at all. The meeting ended awkwardly. Gerald offered his condolences again, mentioned something about being available if they had questions. They filed out of the office in complete silence, stood in the parking lot for a moment not knowing what to say to each other, and that's when the real nightmare began. Here's the thing about families and money. I've thought about this a lot. Money doesn't change people. It just reveals who they really are underneath all the social niceties and family obligations. It strips away the pretense, and this situation, it was about to reveal absolutely everything about everyone involved. 6 weeks passed after that lawyer's office meeting. 6 full weeks. Diane didn't call, didn't text, didn't email, didn't reach out in any way. Rachel tried really hard to give her the benefit of the doubt. Tried to be understanding. Maybe Diane needed time to grieve. Maybe she was overwhelmed with the logistics of managing the estate. Maybe she was figuring out the finances and planning to divide things fairly and just needed some space to get it all organized. Rachel told herself these things, tried to believe them, but 6 weeks turned into 7, then 8, then 9. Michael was absolutely furious. Calling Rachel almost daily, ranting about getting a lawyer, contesting the will, fighting this in court. He kept saying their father couldn't have really wanted this. There must have been undue influence. Diane must have manipulated him. This couldn't be legal. Sophie, on the other hand, wanted to handle things more diplomatically. She suggested writing Diane a letter, polite and respectful, just explaining their financial situations and respectfully asking for what they believed was their fair share. Maybe Diane was just waiting for them to ask. Maybe she didn't know they were expecting anything. Rachel was caught somewhere in between her siblings. Angry, yes. Incredibly angry and hurt. But also hesitant. She didn't want to cause unnecessary drama. Didn't want to make things worse. But she also absolutely did not want to be erased from her father's legacy, like she didn't matter at all. Finally, after 9 weeks of silence, Rachel decided she had to do something. She had to at least try. So she drove to her father's house. Well, it wasn't her father's house anymore, was it? It was Diane's house now. Legally. Completely. The thought made Rachel's stomach turn. She pulled up to the familiar driveway, the same driveway where she'd learned to ride a bike, where Michael had taught her to drive, where the family had taken dozens of photos over the years. She walked up to the porch, that same porch where she'd played as a kid, where she'd sat with her mother on summer evenings. And she rang the doorbell. Diane answered after a long pause. She looked tired, older than Rachel remembered. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. No makeup, wearing jeans and a sweater instead of her usual polished outfits. She stared at Rachel for a long moment through the screen door, and Rachel couldn't read her expression at all. Then, without saying anything, Diane stepped aside and gestured for Rachel to come in. They sat in the living room, the same living room where Rachel's family used to gather for Christmas morning present opening, the same room where her mother used to sit in that corner chair and read books on Sunday afternoons. The same couch where Rachel had cried about her first breakup while her mom held her. It felt completely wrong, like being in a museum dedicated to her own life. Everything was the same, but everything felt different. Rachel tried to stay calm, tried to be diplomatic. She explained as gently as she could that she and her siblings were struggling financially. Student loans, rent, normal life expenses. She mentioned that they'd always believed, based on things their father had said over the years, that he wanted them taken care of, that he'd worked hard specifically so his children would have some security. She appealed to Diane's sense of fairness. Surely Diane understood how they felt. Surely she could see that Robert's wish meant something, even if it wasn't legally binding. Diane listened to the entire speech without interrupting, sat perfectly still. And then she spoke, and her voice was cold. Actually cold. Not even trying to be warm or sympathetic. She said Robert wanted her taken care of because she'd sacrificed 15 years of her life to be his wife. She said the kids had already gotten plenty from Robert over the years. College educations that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Help with rent when they were struggling. Cars. Connections for jobs. They'd had every opportunity. She suggested very carefully but very clearly that maybe they were being a little bit greedy, that maybe they felt entitled to money they hadn't actually earned. And then she said something that absolutely shattered Rachel. She said Robert had told her multiple times over the years that his children were entitled, that they took him for granted, that they needed to learn to make their own way in the world instead of waiting for handouts, that giving them a large inheritance would just enable their lack of ambition, that this will structure was actually doing them a favor by forcing them to be independent. Rachel sat there completely stunned, frozen. Did her father really say those things? Did he really think she was entitled, lazy, ungrateful after everything? After all the years of trying so hard to be good enough, trying to make him proud, trying to live up to his impossibly high expectations. After choosing her career partly because she thought it would impress him, after visiting every holiday and calling every week and trying so desperately to maintain a relationship with a man who was emotionally distant on his best days? Or was Diane lying, making it all up to justify keeping everything? Rachel had no way to know. Her father was dead. He couldn't defend himself or explain or clarify. There was just Diane's word. And Diane's bank account. Rachel left that house shaking. Actually physically shaking, with rage and humiliation and grief all mixed together. Empty-handed. And angrier than she'd ever been in her entire life. The drive back to Portland was a blur. She barely remembers it. She met Michael and Sophie at a coffee shop the next day. Told them word for word what Diane had said. Michael immediately exploded. Started saying they absolutely had to sue, had to claim undue influence, had to argue that Diane had manipulated a grieving widower who wasn't thinking clearly, had to fight. Sophie was more hesitant. She didn't want to drag their father's name through the mud, didn't want to air private family business in court. What if people found out? What if it got ugly? Rachel just felt lost, completely adrift. But Michael was determined. He hired a lawyer, paid $300 for a consultation with an estate litigation specialist, drove all the way to Seattle for the appointment. And the lawyer's verdict was absolutely devastatingly clear. They had no case. None. Zero. The will was legally airtight. Robert had been of completely sound mind when he wrote it. There was zero evidence of coercion or undue influence. Diane hadn't forced him to do anything. The clause about doing the right thing was precatory language, which means it's a moral suggestion with no legal weight whatsoever. They could try to contest it, sure. They could file a lawsuit. But it would cost tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees, drag on for years, destroy what was left of the family, and almost certainly end in complete failure. The lawyer actually recommended they not pursue it, said it would be throwing good money after bad. Michael was absolutely devastated. He'd been so sure they had a case. Sophie started crying again, overwhelmed by the unfairness of it all. Rachel felt utterly hopeless, like all the doors were closing one by one and she was trapped. That's when she remembered the letters. Years ago, maybe 8 or 9 years, Rachel had been home visiting. Her father had asked her to help clean out the attic because it was getting cluttered and he wanted to organize things. They'd spent a Saturday afternoon going through boxes. Old tax records, holiday decorations, random junk. And Rachel had found a box pushed way back in the corner. It was labeled in her father's handwriting. Personal correspondence, 1998 to 2010. She'd asked her father about it. Just curious. And he'd waved her off dismissively. Said it was just old letters, business correspondence. Nothing important. Family stuff from years ago. He'd seemed uncomfortable, actually, and had quickly suggested they work on a different section of the attic. Rachel had shrugged and moved on, forgotten about it. But now, desperate for answers. Desperate to know if Diane had been telling the truth about what Robert said Rachel needed to find that box. She needed to know what was in it. Most of Robert's personal belongings had been moved to a storage unit, while Diane figured out what to do with everything. Michael had the key and the code. Rachel drove there on a Tuesday afternoon when she should have been working. Told her boss she had a family emergency, which technically wasn't a lie. The storage unit was one of those climate-controlled places, with fluorescent lights and concrete floors, and the smell of cardboard and dust. She found the box in the back. Same label. Same handwriting. Her heart was pounding as she opened it. Inside were letters. Dozens of them. Maybe 100. Some in envelopes. Some loose. Some official-looking. Some personal. She started reading, and her entire understanding of her family began to shift. There were letters between Robert and Catherine. Love letters from when they were dating. Letters from when Catherine was sick, talking about her fears and hopes for the kids. Letters about their dreams for the future, for their children's futures. Reading them made Rachel cry because she could hear her mother's voice so clearly in the words, could feel her presence. It was beautiful and heartbreaking. But there were other letters, too, and these told a very, very different story. Letters between Robert and Diane, from before they got married. From when they were dating. And these weren't romantic, not even close. Diane's letters to Robert talked extensively about his success, his business acumen, his financial stability, his assets. She asked in several letters specific questions about his wealth. How was the business doing? What were his plans for retirement? Had he thought about estate planning? She mentioned somewhat casually but repeatedly that his children were young and would eventually move on with their own lives, families. She wrote in one particularly damning letter from 2007, quote, "Marrying you would provide me with the financial security and stability I've never had in my life. This is an opportunity I can't pass up." End quote. It wasn't romantic. It was transactional. She was literally discussing marriage like a business arrangement, and Robert's letters back to her were conflicted, uncertain. He wrote about missing Catherine constantly, about feeling guilty for even thinking about moving on, about worrying that Diane didn't really love him for who he was as a person, about feeling lonely but not sure if marriage was the answer. In one letter to his sister Margaret dated 2008, Robert wrote explicitly that he felt trapped by expectation, that everyone kept telling him he should move on and find companionship, that he didn't know if he actually loved Diane or if he just didn't want to be alone anymore. Quote, "I'm not sure this is right, but I'm too tired to fight it," end quote. Rachel read that letter 3 times. Her father knew. Even back then, he knew something was off. But the absolute worst letter, the one that changed everything, the one that made Rachel's hands shake so badly she almost dropped. It was one Robert had written but never sent, never mailed. It was still in its envelope, sealed, addressed to his children, dated 6 months before he died, March of this year. With trembling fingers, Rachel opened it and read, quote, "My dear children, Michael, Rachel, Sophie, if you're reading this, I'm gone. And I'm sorry. I'm sorry for so many things, but especially for what I'm about to explain. The will isn't what you expected. I know that. I structured it the way I did because Diane insisted. She threatened to leave me if I didn't make her the primary beneficiary. She argued that you kids would contest anything less, that it would tear what's left of our family apart, that making her the sole heir was cleaner and simpler. She promised she would divide things fairly among you after I was gone. She promised. And I believed her, because I wanted to believe her. Because believing her was easier than facing the truth that I'd made a terrible mistake 15 years ago. I know what Diane is. I've known for years. She doesn't love me. She loves the security I provide. She loves the house and the lifestyle and the financial stability. I'm a means to an end, and I accepted that because I was lonely and weak and tired of being alone. I'm sorry. I'm so deeply sorry. I failed you. I failed your mother's memory. Diane was a mistake. I'm too tired and too afraid to fix. I trusted her to do the right thing after I'm gone. Please forgive me if she doesn't. Please understand that I loved you, even if I did a terrible job of showing it. If Diane refuses to honor my wishes, you have every right to do whatever you need to do to claim what's rightfully yours. I won't blame you. I'll only blame myself. With love and regret, Dad." End quote. Rachel read that letter 5 times in a row. Each time she felt a new wave of emotion crash over her. Grief because her father had been in pain and she hadn't known. Anger because he'd been too weak to fix his own mistake and had left them to deal with it. Vindication because she'd been right. Diane was exactly what she suspected. Betrayal because her father had known all of this and had done nothing to protect his children. Just written a letter he didn't even have the courage to send. Her father knew what Diane was. He'd known for years, and he'd done absolutely nothing. Just hoped for the best and dumped the problem on his kids after his death. Rachel sat on the concrete floor of that storage unit for an hour, surrounded by boxes and old furniture and dust, and cried. For her father, for herself, for the entire horrible situation. Then she carefully put all the letters back in the box, loaded it into her car, and drove to her apartment. She called Michael and Sophie, told them they needed to meet immediately. This was urgent. They met at Rachel's apartment that evening. Rachel spread the letters out on her coffee table like evidence at a crime scene, like she was building a case. Which, in a way, she was. Michael read them, his jaw clenched tighter and tighter with each page. Sophie covered her mouth with her hand tears streaming down her face. When they finished, they sat in silence for several minutes, processing, trying to absorb what they'd just learned. Michael spoke first. His voice was cold and determined. "We have her. We finally have her. This is proof. Proof of manipulation. Proof that Dad wanted us to have the money. Proof that Diane is a fraud. We take these to her. We tell her she can divide the estate fairly, or we go public with them. We expose everything." Sophie wasn't sure. She kept saying these were private letters, their father's private thoughts, personal family business. Was it right to use them as weapons? What would Dad think? What would Mom think? But Rachel was past caring about right and wrong, past caring about privacy or propriety or what anyone would think. She wanted justice. No. She wanted revenge. She wanted Diane to feel even a fraction of the humiliation and helplessness that Rachel had felt, sitting in that living room, being called entitled and greedy. They decided together to give Diane one final chance, one last opportunity to do the right thing on her own without threats. Though really Rachel knew they were absolutely planning to threaten her if she refused. The 3 siblings showed up at Diane's door 2 days later, together, united. Michael carried a folder with copies of the most damning letters. They didn't call ahead, didn't warn her, just knocked on the door at 3 in the afternoon on a Thursday. Diane answered looking annoyed, like they were inconveniencing her. She didn't invite them in at first, just stood in the doorway with her arms crossed. Michael simply said, "We need to talk. About Dad's will. And these." And he held up the folder. Diane's expression changed. Just slightly. A flicker of something. Fear, maybe. Or anger. She stepped aside and let them in. They sat in that same living room. That museum of Rachel's childhood. Michael laid out the letters on the coffee table one by one, like a poker player revealing a winning hand. Letters from Diane talking about Robert's money, letters from Robert doubting the marriage, and finally the unsent letter to his children, the apology, the confession. Diane read them all. Slowly, carefully. Her face went pale at first, then gradually hardened into an expression Rachel couldn't quite read. and when she finished the last page, she looked up at the three siblings staring at her expectantly, and she laughed. Not a nervous laugh. A cold, dismissive laugh. She said the letters meant nothing, that Robert was clearly depressed when he wrote them, emotionally unstable, not in his right mind. That he didn't mean any of it. She called the unsent letter a delusion, a symptom of grief that Robert never got over. She suggested the other letters were taken completely out of context. She even implied, though she didn't quite say it directly, that they might be forgeries, even though they were clearly in Robert's handwriting, even though they were dated and detailed and completely consistent. And then she got angry, actually angry. Her voice rose. She said if they tried to use these letters against her, she would fight back with everything she had. She would get a restraining order. She would claim harassment. She would make their lives absolute hell. She would drag them through court for years. And she had the money to do it. $4.2 million. She could afford the best lawyers. Could they? She stood up. Told them to get out of her house. Actually said those words. Get out of my house. Like she owned it. Which legally she did. They left. Walked back to their cars in stunned silence. And Rachel realized something in that moment. Something crystallized in her mind with perfect clarity. Being nice didn't work. Being diplomatic didn't work. Being reasonable didn't work. Legal channels didn't work. Private confrontation didn't work. The only thing left was exposure. Public exposure. Making sure everyone knew exactly who Diane was and what she'd done. Rachel went home that night and made a decision. A decision that would change absolutely everything. That would get her what she wanted, but would cost more than she could possibly anticipate. She sat down at her computer and opened Facebook, and she began to write. She wrote a detailed, thorough account of everything. Diane's calculated pursuit of their father. Robert's doubts and regrets. The will structure and Diane's refusal to honor it. The confrontation and Diane's cold dismissal. She included scans of the letters, all of them. Every damning page. She named names. She included dates. She tagged family friends, Robert's business associates, people from their community, people who'd known her father for decades. She made it completely public. Not friends, only. Public. Anyone could see it. Share it. Comment on it. She wrote a title that would grab attention. My Father's Final Mistake. How Diane Hargrove manipulated a grieving widower and stole our inheritance. She wrote it over 2 hours. Edited it. Made sure everything was clear and factual and sourced. Attached all the scanned letters as photos. And then her finger hovered over the post button. Michael, when she'd called him to tell him what she was planning, had supported her immediately. Told her to do it. Told her Diane deserved it. Told her it was the only way to get justice. Sophie had begged her not to. Had said it would destroy their family's privacy forever. That their father wouldn't have wanted this. That it would make everything so much worse. That once it was out there, they could never take it back. Rachel thought about Sophie's words for exactly 30 seconds. And then she clicked post. It went live at 9 o'clock on a Thursday night. Rachel sat on her couch phone in hand, watching. Within 10 minutes, it had 5 comments. Within 30 minutes, 15 shares. Within an hour, 50 shares. People she'd gone to high school with were sharing it. Distant relatives were commenting. Friends of her father's were expressing shock and support. By morning, when Rachel woke up after barely sleeping, the post had 300 shares. It had been picked up by a local news blog that specialized in community interest stories. Someone had created a Facebook group called Justice for Robert's Children. It had 200 members already. Screenshots of the letters were being shared separately, going viral on their own. By noon, it had 500 shares. A local television news station had called Rachel for an interview. Diane's phone number somehow had been leaked in the comments. Her email address, too. By evening, Rachel's post had been shared 1,200 times. It had 1,500 comments. And things had spiraled completely out of Rachel's control. People started showing up at Diane's house. Not violent, but angry. Standing on the sidewalk, leaving notes. taking photos. Someone posted Diane's address with a message saying she deserved to be shamed publicly. People started calling her phone. Dozens of calls. Hundreds of calls. Leaving voicemails calling her a gold digger, a manipulator, a thief, and much worse things. Much worse. Diane's email was flooded. People were sending her messages on every platform. Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. Angry messages. Cruel messages. On Saturday, 3 days after Rachel's post, someone vandalized Diane's car. Spray painted the word thief across the hood in red paint. Slashed 2 tires. The police were called. It made the local news, which brought even more attention to the story. Diane couldn't go to the grocery store without being recognized, without people whispering, staring, following her with their phones out recording her. She was essentially trapped in the house. Rachel watched all of this unfold from her apartment in Portland, and she felt a confusing mix of emotions. Part of her felt vindicated, satisfied. Diane was finally facing consequences for her actions, finally being held accountable in a way the legal system wouldn't allow. Justice, in a way. But another part of her felt increasingly sick. This wasn't what she'd intended. She'd wanted people to know the truth. She hadn't wanted mob violence, hadn't wanted harassment, hadn't wanted things to get scary. But it was too late. The internet had taken her story and run with it, and there was no way to stop it now. On the 4th day after the post went viral, Diane's lawyer called Rachel's lawyer. Well, Rachel had gotten a lawyer by this point because she was terrified she might be sued for defamation or harassment. Diane wanted to settle, wanted to make this go away. She was offering to split the estate, $1 million to each sibling. She would keep $1.2 million and the house. In exchange, Rachel had to delete the post. No more public statements, no interviews. A complete, permanent break. Rachel, Michael, and Sophie met in person to discuss. Drove to Seattle to meet at Michael's apartment. Sophie was horrified, but not by the offer. By what had happened, the death threats Diane had received. Actual death threats. Someone had called and said they knew where she lived and were coming for her. The vandalism, the harassment, the mob mentality. Sophie looked directly at Rachel, her eyes red from crying, and said, "This isn't justice. This is a mob. This is cruelty. We've become exactly what we accused Diane of being." Rachel didn't know what to say, because Sophie was right. But also, they were getting the money. Their father's wishes were being honored. Wasn't that the whole point? Wasn't that what they'd wanted? Michael wanted to accept immediately. Said they'd won. This was exactly what they'd fought for. $3 million divided 3 ways. Justice. But Rachel couldn't stop thinking about the comments on her post. She read through them late that night, unable to sleep. Thousands of them. Some praised her for standing up to a gold digger, for refusing to be silenced, for fighting for what was right. But others called her cruel, vindictive, a spoiled brat who'd aired dirty family laundry for money. Someone had dug up Rachel's past, her DUI from when she was 24. A messy breakup from years ago where her ex had made some unflattering comments. A former employer who was quoted saying, Rachel had been difficult to work with and argumentative. The internet wasn't just judging Diane anymore. It was judging Rachel too, picking apart her life, questioning her motives, debating whether she was a hero or a villain. And then Diane did something unexpected. She gave an interview to a local television news station, sat down in front of cameras and cried, real tears streaming down her face. She talked about how much she'd loved Robert, how devastated she was by his death, how she'd always planned to give the children their inheritance but had wanted some time to grieve first, to process, to figure things out properly. She said the letters were taken completely out of context, that Robert had been depressed, not thinking clearly, that she'd devoted 15 years of her life to making him happy. She painted herself as a grieving widow, being attacked by impatient stepchildren who couldn't even wait a few months before demanding their money, who'd sicked an internet mob on her for wanting time to mourn. It was a masterful performance, And it worked. Public opinion started to shift. People who'd been supporting Rachel started questioning. Maybe she'd been too harsh. Maybe she should have waited longer. Maybe she should have tried harder to resolve things privately before going nuclear. Maybe this really was just about greed disguised as justice. Rachel watched that interview 3 times, and she felt the ground shifting beneath her. She'd been so absolutely certain she was right, so sure she was the wronged party. But now, watching Diane cry on television, listening to her present, a completely different narrative, Rachel wasn't sure of anything anymore. She agreed to meet Diane one final time. Alone. No lawyers, no siblings, just the 2 of them, face to face, woman to woman. They sat in that living room again. The museum. Both of them looked completely exhausted, defeated, like this whole battle had drained something essential from both of them. Diane slid the settlement papers across the coffee table. They'd already been drawn up by lawyers, ready to sign. $3 million split 3 ways among the siblings, $1 million each. Rachel would receive her share within 30 days of signing. The Facebook post had to be deleted immediately. All copies of the letters had to be turned over. No further public statements from either party. A mutual non-disparagement clause. Clean break. Rachel stared at the papers. This was it. This was what she'd fought for. What she'd destroyed Diane's reputation for. What she'd sacrificed her family's privacy for. What she'd spent months obsessing over. The justice she'd demanded. And it was right there. $1 million. Financial security. Vindication. But it felt hollow. Empty. Not like winning at all. Diane's voice was quiet. Tired. Was it worth it? Destroying me? Turning my life into a nightmare? Setting a mob on me? Was the money worth that? Rachel looked up, met her eyes, and said, was it worth it? Marrying a man you didn't love for his money? Manipulating him for 15 years, stealing $4 million from his children? Neither of them had an answer. They just stared at each other across that coffee table in a house full of ghosts and regrets. Rachel signed the papers. Her hand shook slightly, but she signed. Diane signed. And then Rachel stood up to leave. She was done. It was over. As Rachel reached the front door, her hand on the handle, Diane said one more thing. Just 4 words, but they cut deep. Your father would be ashamed of you. Rachel stopped, turned around slowly, and said he should have been ashamed of himself. And then she walked out, got in her car, drove back to Portland, and that was the last time she ever saw or spoke to Diane. The money was transferred exactly 30 days later. Each sibling received $1 million minus taxes and legal fees. They each ended up with about $750,000 after everything was paid. Diane kept the house and approximately $900,000 after her own legal fees. The Facebook post was deleted, but screenshots circulated for months. Still do, actually. The story had been covered by news outlets, shared on Reddit, discussed on podcasts about family drama and inheritance disputes. The internet never forgets. Some family friends stopped speaking to them, completely cut them off, said what Rachel did was unforgivable, that she'd dragged Robert's name through the mud, that she'd destroyed family dignity for money. Others congratulated them, said they'd stood up to a manipulator, that they'd refused to be victims, that Diane had gotten what she deserved. The family was divided, permanently. Michael had absolutely no regrets. None at all. He invested his share in the stock market and some rental properties, quit his job 6 months later, moved to Austin to start his own business. He called Rachel once to thank her, to tell her she had the guts to do what needed to be done, to do what their father didn't have the courage to do. He said she was a hero. Rachel wasn't sure she believed that. Sophie gave half of her money to charity, actually wrote checks to various organizations her mother had cared about. She told Rachel in a tearful phone conversation that she felt dirty taking the money, that the whole thing had been a nightmare, that she wished they'd never found those letters. That ignorance would have been better than this. She barely speaks to Rachel now, texts on birthdays, sends a generic Christmas card. But the closeness they once had is gone. Maybe forever. Sophie can't look at Rachel without remembering what happened, without remembering the mob and the vandalism and the cruelty of it all. And Rachel. Rachel paid off her student loans, all $60,000 of them. Bought a small 2-bedroom condo in a decent neighborhood in southeast Portland. Started seeing a therapist twice a week to process everything. Put the rest of her money in savings and investments. She's financially stable now in a way she never was before. No debt. Owns her home. Has a cushion. Security. But 6 months later, sitting in that condo on a rainy Tuesday evening, she still thinks about it. About her father. About Diane. About the letters. About the posts that went viral. About the consequences that spun out of her control. The money is there. In her account. Real and tangible. She can see the balance when she checks her bank app. $743,000. After buying the condo. Life-changing money. Money that means she doesn't have to worry about every expense. Money that means freedom and security and possibilities. But she can't shake the feeling that she lost something too. Something she can't quite name or quantify. Something that has to do with who she thought she was, versus who she became in those weeks of rage and desperation and calculated revenge. She wonders if her father really would be ashamed of her. Probably. Maybe. She wonders if Diane was always a cold, calculating manipulator, or if grief and fear and desperation had turned her into one. Maybe Diane had actually loved Robert in her own way. Or maybe not. Rachel will never know. She wonders if there was another way. A better way. A way that didn't involve public humiliation and internet mobs and broken relationships. Probably there was. Some path she didn't see, because she was too angry and too hurt to look for it. Some days sitting in her condo, drinking her morning coffee, she thinks she'd do it all again. Stand up. Fight back. Refuse to be erased. Demand justice in whatever way she could get it. Other days, usually late at night when she can't sleep, she's not sure. Because the cost of winning was so much higher than she'd ever imagined. Her relationship with Sophie is fractured. Maybe permanently broken. They might never be close again. The family name is associated with scandal now. A quick Google search of their last name brings up articles and forum posts and Reddit threads and opinions from thousands of strangers who don't know any of them, who don't understand the complexity, who've reduced their entire family history to a simple narrative of good versus evil, hero versus villain, depending on which side of the debate they fall on. Her father's legacy isn't his 30 years of business success, isn't his charitable contributions, or his community involvement, or the buildings he developed, or the jobs he created. It's a viral Facebook post about manipulation and greed and family dysfunction. That's what people will remember. That's what comes up when you search his name. Rachel sits in her condo, sometimes looking out the window at the city below, at the rain falling on the streets of Portland, and thinks about inheritance. Not the money kind, the other kind. The kind you can't divide up in a will, or fight over in court, or claim with lawyers. Her mother's kindness and compassion. Her father's emotional distance, and his inability to fix his own mistakes. The family's dysfunction and communication problems. The capacity for both deep love and calculated cruelty that exists in all of them, all of us if we're honest. That's the real inheritance. And unlike money, you can't refuse it. You can't sign it away. You can't put it in an account somewhere and not think about it. You carry it with you. In your decisions and your relationships and the person you become. For better or worse. So, was Rachel wrong? I've thought about this question for months now. Turned it over and over in my mind. Looked at it from every angle. And here's what I keep coming back to. She fought for what was rightfully hers. She exposed manipulation and calculated greed. She refused to be erased from her father's legacy. She demanded justice in a system that legally gave her none. She stood up when it would have been easier to walk away. And she won. She got the money, she got vindication. She got to feel for at least a moment like she'd righted a wrong. But she also destroyed privacy, weaponized the internet and social media, turned private family pain into public spectacle and entertainment, damaged relationships that may never heal, lost her sister in all the ways that matter, contributed to harassment and cruelty and mob violence, even if she didn't directly intend those consequences, changed her father's legacy from a successful businessman to a cautionary tale about bad marriages and estate planning mistakes. Here's the thing about justice. It's not clean. It's not simple. It doesn't tie up neatly with a bow. Sometimes getting what you legally or morally deserve means losing what you emotionally value. Sometimes being factually right doesn't mean you handled the situation right. Sometimes winning costs more than you anticipated paying. Rachel got justice, but justice came with a price tag she didn't fully read before she signed up for it. The question isn't whether she was right or wrong. The question is whether the price was worth paying. Whether the money and the vindication were worth the fractured family and the public scandal and the late-night doubts. Whether winning felt the way she thought it would when she was making the decision to fight. And, honestly, only Rachel knows the answer to that. And I'm not sure she knows yet. Maybe she never will. I think about the different ways this story could have gone. If Diane had honored Robert's wishes from the very beginning. If Robert had been braver and clearer in his will. If he'd confronted his mistake while he was alive instead of leaving it for his kids to deal with. If Rachel had chosen a longer, quieter legal battle instead of viral public exposure. If Sophie's plea for restraint and privacy had been heard and heeded. But that's not what happened. What happened is messy and complicated and painfully, achingly human. Just like most real stories. Just like most of us when we're pushed to our limits. What I do know is this. Family and money are a dangerous, volatile combination. They force impossible choices. Between loyalty and self-preservation, between silence and truth, between forgiveness and accountability, between keeping peace and demanding justice. And sometimes, honestly, there are no good choices. Just choices we make in moments of pain and anger, choices we have to live with for the rest of our lives. Rachel chose truth over peace, justice over privacy, her own financial security and her father's stated wishes over family harmony. Whether that makes her a hero or a villain depends entirely on who you ask, on which values you prioritize, on what you think family means, and what obligations we owe to people who don't treat us fairly. Maybe it makes her both a hero and a villain. Maybe that's the most honest answer there is. Maybe we're all capable of being both, depending on the circumstances and what we're fighting for. Because real life doesn't come with neat endings. It doesn't come with clear moral lessons or obvious right answers. It comes with consequences, with compromises, with the heavy weight of decisions we make when we're desperate and angry and hurt and scared. Rachel has her money now. She has her condo. She has her financial stability and security. But she also has her reg.